Hello folks, Tom here. So the original plan was to do a follow-up to my top Master System games rundown and do my top Mega Drive games. However, trying to get a list shorter than anything from around 40 is proving really difficult, and as for figuring out what order they go in, that's a whole different project altogether. So for now, I thought I would concentrate on a small library of games released, and as I have had a sudden resurgence in collecting old titles, my attention has been drawn to games published under the Electronic Arts label. Back when I was a wee one, renting games was your best bet for a good weekend in, and if you were smart, you would rent games on a Friday, so you would get that one extra day due to the store being shut on a Sunday. At least that was my experience. But most Mega Drive games could be completed in one sitting, so picking something that would last a whole 3 days could be a stab in the dark. That is, of course, unless they came with that glorious yellow label. Yes, EA published games have always had a reputation, in my mind at least, of being long, complicated, and with often weird graphics and music. So with that in mind, here are my top 12 EA published Sega Mega Drive games. This one gets a spot on here mostly through nostalgia. Shadow of the Beast is an odd little game. Actually, no, it's a rubbish game with a very odd design. You play as Arbron, a man who was kidnapped as a child and turned into some sort of super warrior slave, and it is your mission to travel the land to break the curse. This is a side-scrolling action-adventure game with a large emphasis on pattern memorization. When you begin, you are plonked in the middle of the countryside with no hint as to which direction to run. Instinct will fuel your first failed attempt by venturing to the right, where you will encounter many of the bizarre creatures the game has to offer. You are armed only with a punch and jump kick, and pretty soon you will realise that the hit detection is absolutely awful, and enemies are placed purposefully to infuriate you. You have a maximum health of 12, and it is a no extra life type of game, so once you're dead, you have to start over. I'm probably not doing too well to sell it thus far, but Shadow of the Beast does have something about it which makes it tempting to go back to. The game is rock solid hard, and each time you play it you will get a few inches further, but it isn't too much of an annoyance as the game is really short, and it is finding out the enemy placements and what sequence you have to do the game in, which makes it rewarding. The music is also memorable, and some of the enemy and setting designs resemble a mixture of Splatterhouse and the works of H.R. Geiger, worth checking out for the odd factor alone. I hear people mention Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego quite often, but Where in Time is the game that captured my imagination, which is probably down to having a semi-sci-fi setting. The Carmen Sandiego installment is virtually the exact same as its counterpart, which isn't too surprising as they are both based off a fact-based game show.
Just a reminder, all our fact fuel is verified by Encyclopedia Britannica.
You take the role of a detective from the Acme agency who is tasked with the job of ultimately capturing the time-travelling crook Carmen Sandiego by first tracking down her henchmen. Everything is done from an interface point of view as you travel around to different points in time with use of your chrono skimmer. Each round will start with a ludicrous crime, for instance the theft of Rasputin's beard, giving you a starting date, location and time limit to catch the henchman in. Though if we can travel through time, doesn't that make the time limit redundant? Anyway, each location gives you options that will eat into your time allowance. You can talk to a witness, an informant or scan for objects. If you get a lead on where to go next, you can apply your knowledge of a history and choose the right location from your chrono skimmer. And knowledge is really the key part here, as this is at its core an educational game, testing you of your basic teachings of geography and history. It's funny, I never really picked up on this being even slightly educational when I was younger, which could possibly be seen as somewhat of an ironic reflection of intellect. As a child, I was really big into the Young Sherlock Holmes movie, and I just thought it was really cool to be able to play as a detective in any game, but this had the additional time travel elements that I was fascinated by after seeing Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, so it ticked all the right boxes. Next up we have Fatal Rewind, which might be better known as The Killing Game Show. I'm not sure why they changed the title when they brought it over to the Mega Drive. Reminds me of how the Japanese title for The Evil Within is Psycho Break, which is far better. It took me years to finally track down what this game was, as I only had a vague memory stored in the grey matter. I knew I'd rented it back in the day, and I had a distant memory of it being a puzzle-style platformer with rising toxic waste. You take control of the gun-toting robot, heavily inspired by Ed 209 from Robocop, and it is your job to scale each level to its highest vertical point in order to escape. Each level gives you a running head start before the timer in the corner starts to count down to 0, and once it begins, the level begins to fill up from the bottom with instant death. stopping you from running straight to the exit are numerous enemies that will fly at you in waves and locked doors that require keys. It's all about learning the quickest way to get from point A to point B before the tide comes in, and the ability to be only able to hold one item at a time makes it extra tense when you realise you've gone for the wrong key. There are two things I'll mention if you're thinking about picking up Fatal Rewind. The first is that to use an item you have to hold A and then press B, which is ridiculous. And secondly, the stage loops, so running from left to right will cover the same ground. Imagine it like running around the outside of a circular tower. This makes it really confusing until you figure out what's actually going on. With those two things considered, an easy one to pick up and play. I'll be honest, I absolutely hated this game growing up. I thought the music was mind-numbing, the graphics were naff, and I found the gameplay overall to be confusing and unrewarding. King's Bounty is the first of two games in this list that were developed by New World Computing, and they both follow the same trait that will become apparent as being an ambitious port of a game designed more for the home computer. You take control of our knight in shining armour as he travels the land to search for the lost pieces of the Scepter of Order. You have a time limit of so many days to complete your quest, and you are left to your own devices on how you are going to proceed. This is somewhat of an open world game. From the very start you are horse mounted and plonked in the middle of a vast kingdom. From here you can build up your army by purchasing units and take to the land and seas to find treasure and battle enemies. Combat in the game is turn based and operates on a fixed grid. Units must be moved within their attack range in order to fight, and each unit has its own different strength. It is a style of game that has been improved upon many times since its release, but there is a simplistic charm to it that still makes it fun to play. The character animations are only a few frames looped, and the battlegrounds are mainly one colour. The sound effects are pretty poor, but once you start getting into it, building your army and exploring the map, it becomes oddly endearing. It is probably mostly nostalgia and the urge to understand the game that had previously left me bewildered, but King's Bounty, for all its flaws, holds my attention along with its place in this list. I don't think Road Rash needs too much of an introduction. The first Road Rash was great. It introduced violence and a punk vibe to a racing genre, which was still yet to be perfected. Road Rash 2 was very much the same, albeit more refined. You take the helm of a superpowered motorcycle and hurtle at full speed in a faux 3D perspective, avoiding traffic and punching players as you pass them. If you hit a car, you'll go hurtling miles down the road, and there is no simple respawning here. It is a long old fractured pelvis waddle back to wherever your bike landed. It is simple, frantic fun, and it hasn't got boring since its release. Space has always been the easiest setting to pull the wool over our eyes and make us think that we're playing what could potentially be interpreted as an endless galaxy, and Starflight is a perfect example of just that. Hot on the heels of Elite, this helps to set the groundwork for the many titles to come, including most prevalently aspects of Mass Effect, as a completely sandbox experience. You take the role of a ship's captain, along with a crew that you'll have to create, on a voyage to explore the galaxy in search of the source of the impending imploding stars which threaten to wipe out inhabitants. To achieve this, you must fly around the solar system, visit planets, collect resources, form allegiances with aliens, or shoot them out into space, and gain information on where to go next. This is an enormous game, with 800 planets to visit, hours and hours of gameplay, and no indication to which way to really progress. It's quite a difficult one to explain, other than to say that it's just really immersive. Turn off all other distractions, turn off the lights, and just fly through space. General Chaos is a rather unique mashup of the RTS genre. You take on the duties of the titular Chaos General and pick from one of 4 squads of troops to invade and take over chosen locations from the field map. Each squad has a different weapons loadout which will play to your advantage depending on your style of play, and these range from machine guns to grenades, rocket launchers and flamethrowers. The gameplay itself is something that I don't believe I've seen too many other games do. Rather than having a huge map to move your troops around, you have a small battlefield with objects and obstructions between you and the enemy squad. At first it looks like this will be a turn-based game, moving your troops to cover and strategically around the play area, but it all happens in real time. You can select one troop at any time and move to a location and aim their weapon, and upon firing, all units will fire at the nearest enemy. Allies that are moved into close quarters with an enemy unit will engage in fisticuffs, and it is one-on-one fighting where you can control punches and kicks. If a fellow troop is downed, a medic will run onto the battlefield to pull them to safety, allowing them to respawn after an allotted period of time, and victory is accomplished when all enemy soldiers are defeated. The game is hugely fun to play. It is a great blend of being really simple yet requiring thought. The art style is also perfectly realised, and should you happen to have a multi-tap, up to 4 people can join at once, sharing one squad between 2 players each. Just be careful to make sure that you don't order your flamethrower unit to swim through the water. I can't say I have ever watched the old Buck Rogers TV shows. It wasn't something that was commonly on in England in the early 90s. However, having played Countdown to Doomsday, I've always been intrigued. This is an isometric tile-based RPG, similar in spirit to games like Pool of Radiance, but taking more of a combat-driven approach of something like Shining Force. You begin by creating your party of New Earth Organisation crew in classic RPG fashion by performing re-rolls to determine stats, along with race, gender, class and skills. There are a perplexing amount of skills to choose from at first, and if you don't know what you are doing, it will probably take you a few attempts to start building a party best suited. Each character you create will also require a custom name, and you'll be able to choose their gameplay visual. You begin on a salvage station on important salvage business, which is promptly attacked by invading forces, kicking off the plot right away. The art style in the game is simplistic, giving you a basic outline of buildings that can be interpreted by the accompanying artwork located in the top right image. This part of the UI is also host to character interactions, giving you a more detailed look at portraits and models. It's a nice touch to get around the limitations of what could be shown on screen, and for the most part they provide a small bit of animation. Combat in the game is relatively simple. Enemies and allies are placed around the battlefield, and you'll be given your chance percentage of attack from where you're standing, or you can move around the board to better increase your accuracy. Attacks vary from close range to short and long range, and explosive attacks. When each battle ends, you will collect the spoils of war, along with experience. Main plot points are told through full screen visuals, and the game vamps along at a pleasing pace. This style of game is an easy one to hold up well, but Buck Rogers still manages to exceed in a few areas that puts it above similar games of the time. The music is consistently pleasing, and the art style and setting, whilst simplistic, is a welcome sci-fi change to what is usually a fantasy medieval setting. And any game where you can create a whole party is a winner in my book. A definite one for the strategy RPG fan. The second New World computing game to make my list, Might and Magic Gates to Another World, is about as old school at RPG as they come. This game is huge. The back of the box states 100 hours of adventuring, which while most probably an overly ambitious statement, could still be true depending on the player. This is a first-person 3D perspective dungeon crawler with turn-based battles. Starting the game for the first time will be familiar to any fan of Western RPGs. You will have a choice of selecting from a set menu of characters or creating your own. If you choose to go down the creation route, you will have a generated stats based on dice rolls and assign races, classes and genders. You will start out at an inn located in the centre of a town with no map, equipment or clue as to where to go or what to do, and you will probably get frustrated within about 5 minutes and turn the game off. But if you do stick with it, what you will experience is one of the earlier examples of the dungeon crawler genre that really hasn't evolved that much since the early titles. Getting your bearings is the most difficult thing to do here, so here are a few quick tips to get you started. You will need to go to this completely random wall and drink from the Fountain of Clairvoyance. This will give you a map essentially. You can use this over and over and it is essential. Then head over to the blacksmith and buy some basic armour for your party and green tickets. Green tickets allow you to compete in the fighting arena so you can start levelling up and gaining some gold. Visually, for an early title, the game doesn't look half bad. All of the enemies are big, colourful and animated, and there is enough variety to keep things interesting. Combat will take up the majority of your time, and depending on whether you created a winning party at the start will become apparent early on. You can choose to attack with melee weapons, ranged attacks, or use magic spells. Magic is probably the focus of the game, as the title would suggest, and there is no hand-holding here in telling you what anything does. That is where you will have to refer to the quite staggering amount of information in the instruction manual. I bet you millennials have no idea what an instruction manual is. It's the thing you used to read on the bus ride home, having had to go to a shop to buy a game because Amazon didn't exist. It probably doesn't look much by today's standards, but if you think back to a time when most games were about jumping up and down and scrolling left to right, this was enormous for a console release, and one that would certainly give you your money's worth. It was a toss-up between desert and jungle, but Jungle Strike just about takes the lead for me. Helicopters were one of the coolest things growing up, and sadly, in gaming, they have seemed to have lost their luster. The Strike games have you piloting an attack chopper whilst you fly around an isometric map, killing enemies, destroying buildings and vehicles, and rescuing hostages. Each level takes place in a different location and sets out a number of objectives that you have to complete in order to finish the level, and these will usually be along the lines of blow up that thing or save that person. It would have been easy to try to overly complicate the mechanics and try to introduce something like a first-person faux 3D. But where the Strike games exceed is with their realised gameplay and setting. The chopper controls perfectly and the combat is satisfying. Firing a flurry of bullets into a building that eventually explodes and comes apart never stops being rewarding, and the game consistently runs at a smooth frame rate. There is no in-mission music in the game, but that is saved by the pleasing sound effects, and I always especially like the clunky mechanical sound when you pick something up. Just awesome. You do get some variety in vehicles in terms of a hoverboat, which looks like the last scene from Captain Phillips, and a stealth bomber. This is just really fun, and it doesn't really need much more explanation to make my list. How to best describe the Immortal? I suppose on paper it is an isometric adventure game with puzzle solving and combat elements, but it feels like it's a bit more than that. You take control of a wizard as he descends into a labyrinth in search of his mentor Mordemir. You'll make your way from room to hallway encountering monsters, traps and logic puzzles. Traps are commonplace and they will range from falling through a weak floor tile to incoming projectiles to hidden enemies. Combat in the game is frankly a load of old bumwash. You dodge left to right avoiding enemy attacks until their fatigue is at maximum, and then you proceed to make them sneeze until the time comes that you can land a finishing blow. Luckily, one-on-one combat is for the most part avoidable by using magic items, and should you win a fight you are presented with some impressive gory finishing moves. Where the game excels is with its atmosphere, the music, art style and unforgivable trial by fire difficulty. All make for a really immersive experience. Puzzle difficulty is challenging but not too illogical that it kills the pace or takes you out of the game. However, if you do become unstuck, each level of the labyrinth is accessible via a password system, which means you can always reach for your Dirty Rotten's tips book to skip over a level. But it is the sense of achievement from not cheating that puts this one so high on my list. The Immortal saw multiple releases, so will probably be available on your retro machine of choice, but in any incarnation, one to definitely have a run at, just try not to cheat your way through. Before Naughty Dog was famous for big A-star blockbuster games, it was little more than a bedroom production formed by Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, who with their eyes set on the computer market, took a slight left turn and produced their cult classic Rings of Power on the Sega Mega Drive instead. You play as a young sorcerer called Buck,
Hot young Buck,
who has accepted the quest to source the lost 11 Rings of Power in order to reforge the Rod of Creation to destroy the evil void. Pretty standard stuff. This is a turn-based RPG with quite a unique design. The game overworld takes place on a 10x10 grid. Moving around will mostly cause one set of tiles to pop in whilst the opposing side gets pushed out. It can be quite confusing at first and kind of off-putting, but I found it to be quite imaginative. It reminds me of board games like Hero Quest where certain parts of the map, mainly doors, would protrude from the board. As you travel around you will find towers, buildings and NPCs to talk to. All of the characters throughout the game have something to say and can engage in dialogue trees, item exchanges or a punch-up. Combat can be automatic or manual, though you'll be hard pushed to get anywhere in the early game by using the automatic mode. Starting out you only have one spell, Stun, and this along with your character is pretty weak. Allies and foes will move around the battle board as they perform actions. There is no particular benefit to this, it just helps to add well needed animation to each battle. The starting hours of Rings of Power are very unforgiving if you don't know what you're doing, and even then the chances are that you will get mauled by a couple of bears or killed by a dragon. The game is convoluted and at times bewildering, but it is also incredibly unique and intriguing. Unlike the other games in this list, I don't particularly have any nostalgia for Rings of Power. I knew of its existence, but I never bothered to play it until very recently. It's been in my collection for a while now, and when I finally got around to sitting down and putting a few hours into it, all I wanted to do was find out more about the game. At the heart of it, it's really an adventure game with RPG elements added on, and the difficulty level only ramps up as you progress through. It certainly isn't for everyone, but it is the exact sort of obscure, semi-broken time sink that grabs my attention, and for it to grab my attention with no real prior knowledge has earned its place in my top spot. As always, thank you very much for listening to me waffle on in my weird inflected English, and to the new subscribers I've had over the past months, I really appreciate that. Apologies for not getting a video out sooner, it's been quite a busy period for me of lately, but I hope to get a new one out soon. Cheers!